Welcome to the Good Faith Podcast. I'm your host, Curtis Chang. And the Good Faith Podcast is where friends who follow Jesus help each other make sense of the world. The podcast is a production of Redeeming Babel, a 501c3 nonpartisan organization. We here at Good Faith are going through a short series on the topic of immigration, where we periodically examine different aspects of immigration. We opened by talking about how ICE raids are threatening local churches. And you can access our conversation with Pastor Paco Amador from Chicago in a recent episode. For this episode, we wanted to flip the script and ask how local churches can be a positive force in immigration. We wanted to explore the intersection of local churches and a key aspect of immigration, namely our country's response to refugees. For this discussion, I'm glad to welcome Myal Greene, President and CEO of World Relief, a leading Christian agency that, among other tasks, mobilizes local churches to care for refugees. Myal has a long history in Christian leadership on this issue and has also had previous experience working in the U.S. government. Myal, welcome to the Good Faith Podcast.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me on, Curtis.
Yeah, let's just start right into it. And let's begin by defining our terms.
Sure.
What exactly is a refugee, and how would you distinguish it from other people coming into this country?
That's a great question. And so refugees are individuals who are fleeing a well-founded, a credible threat of persecution, typically on the base of race, gender, political views, ethnic group, and religion. And they're individuals who've crossed the borders of a country already, and then are at that status of being a refugee. And so there's many different immigrant categories, but for refugees, these are individuals who specifically have fled some sort of crisis or persecution that they're facing and have credible threats of that.
Okay, and give our audience some sense of the scale of refugees and the refugee crisis, both globally, but also specifically in the U.S.
Yeah, so right now we're actually living through the world's greatest displacement crisis. And so there's over 123 million people in the world who have been forcibly displaced from their homes. And that includes a few categories other than refugees, but these are individuals who, because of persecution, violence, conflict, different factors, have been forced out of their homes, forced out of their home communities. Roughly a third of those individuals are refugees who have fled outside of their country and meet that legal definition I described of being a refugee. Others are internally displaced. So maybe you're in one part of the Democratic Republic of Congo, displaced to another region, but you haven't crossed the border, and those would be internally displaced people. And so today there's more refugees in the world than any time in recorded history. And I've been in humanitarian work for 18 years, and that number has increased fourfold since the time that I became a humanitarian worker about 20 years ago. And so this is really a crisis that we're living through right now, and a very significant one.
So I think you said about over 120 million, right?
That's right.
And so how many of them have entered the U.S. out of that 120 million?
So a very, very small number come to this country. So in 2024, which was the last year of the Biden administration, the target for refugees to be welcomed in the country was about 125,000. Wow. Just over 100,000 actually entered that year. And that was one of the highest years on record. And you take that back to comparison to some of the years in the first Trump administration, that number was around 10, 12,000, 20,000. So it fluctuates year to year, but a very small fraction of the total number of refugees in the world.
So explain why that is on both ends of those issues. Like, why are we seeing the history's greatest increase in refugees? Like, what's happening in the world? And then kind of, why is the U.S. taking such a small slice of that onto its shoulders?
Yeah, well, if you look out and you read the newspapers, you pay attention to the news, you're a globally minded individual, you see the fact that there are devastating conflicts and wars around the world. And so I think we all, a decade ago, began tracking and understanding things that were happening in Syria. And that was really one of the first events that really marked this dramatic uptick. And that was followed by what we saw happen in Afghanistan, what we're seeing happen in Ukraine, what some of the conflicts that we see across Africa. Today in Sudan, it's the world's largest humanitarian crisis. It probably does not get the same level of notoriety and news attention as the war in Ukraine or the crisis in Gaza are receiving, but there's 30 million people who are in need of humanitarian assistance in Sudan today. And so the world has actually become a more fragile place in a certain set of countries of the world, and it's driving this displacement crisis today.
And then what about like the U.S.? Like what historically has been the U.S. governmental sort of policy and posture in response to this crisis?
Yeah, so the refugee admittance program that we operate and World Relief has been an implementing partner of over the years really came about in 1980 in response to the Vietnamese boat crisis with many Southeast Asians coming to the U.S. As refugees at the time, and many faith-based organizations and other organizations standing up to welcome these individuals and begin helping them find placement and new homes in the U.S. And then that was formalized under the Refugee Act into a formal legislation. And generally speaking, for the better part of 40 years, that was a nonpartisan, non-controversial recognition that when there are individuals who are fleeing very credible threats in the world, we have a moral responsibility to be agents of welcome and welcome people into this country. A lot of that has changed in the last few years, especially with the hyperpolarization around immigration issues. And it's really led to a lot of misstatements and misperspectives about refugee programs in general or other humanitarian programs supporting individuals that are fleeing violence and persecution.
You said that the origins of, kind of the U.S. response before this hyper polarized situation that has sort of divided our country in terms of how to respond to refugees. But back in the I don't know the good old days of when there was more of a consensus that America as a country should be responding positively and favorably to refugees coming to their country. Describe the role of churches. You mentioned that a little bit when you're describing the response to the Vietnamese boat crisis. Like how crucial historically have churches played a role in the overall country's response to the refugees?
Well, really from the beginning of the refugee resettlement program, churches were on the front lines of this work. And World Relief, even how we got into that work is very unique. It really begins with a couple missionaries from the Christian Missionary Alliance who, Grady and Evelyn Mangum, who had spent many years in Vietnam. And as the story goes, the State Department called them up, and a person from the State Department who had known their work in Vietnam as missionaries said, can you help these people that are coming? Can you and your churches be a part of welcoming these individuals? And so the Christian Missionary Alliance, the story goes that Evelyn's called every single church in the phone book of the CMA denomination. When they ran out of it, they turned and looked and saw the NAE, which the National Association of Evangelicals directory, and picked that up and started calling churches through there and finding places and saying, we've got this family coming in next week. Will you take them? And welcoming them. And I've spent time with Evelyn's daughter, and she's told so many stories that from Evelyn's work in those years where, people had said things like, well, I've got a parking lot to build that I'm working on. I'm going to have to pass. And then her response was, these are people. You're choosing a parking lot over people. And got a phone call the next day saying, okay, we changed our mind. We're going to take this family on and be sacrificial and loving. And I think it is that level of commitment that sometimes we don't see today. And as World Relief does this work and we go into a church, sometimes it's like pulling teeth to mobilize a group of volunteers and say, oh, we'll give you a few volunteers for this. When really, I think what we need to go back to is think about the roots and the history here to say what the true sacrificial engagement has been. And I do see many examples of that today as well, of groups that have welcomed Afghans in the last year or welcomed Ukrainians or welcomed others in this season. But it really was the foundation of this program was faith communities reaching out and connecting people and helping them find belonging in their new community, and the church being at the heart of that.
Well, what has happened to that network of churches, especially as the politicization of immigration has taken place? Like, what do you see at the church ground level? Are they getting divided? Are they still responding? What's happening?
Well, I think when you look at um, Christianity in America today, you see a lot of different um, perspectives on immigration, and so I think it's real hard to kind of put all churches into the same bucket
Yeah.
in this season. I think you know that well, and as a listener of your show, I think you talk about those dynamics regularly. But one thing that I'm seeing is, of course, there's a lot of anti-immigration political rhetoric, and that oftentimes falls with a very strong overlap to evangelical churches that have shared affinity for the same political candidates and leaders and in that season. And I think those things conflate each other and cause confusion. And so there very clearly are, I think, in a lot of churches today, um, traditional evangelical churches who hold very anti-immigrant views there. And those, are views that are in contrary to scripture into that understanding. But I also believe, and we've done research and polling over the years with Lifeway Research, which is a Christian research firm affiliated with the Southern Baptist Convention, that really shows evangelicals overwhelmingly have much more open-minded, welcoming perspectives towards immigrants as a whole than what the media would report or people would engage with. However, I think that the challenge is it's almost a crisis of leadership at times. And I think there's a lot of church leaders, especially in this season where it's kind of post-COVID, post a lot of social unrest in society, where pastors are hesitant to raise their voice and speak about a topic that is so much at the heart of the political conversation today. And I think that that's where people are yearning for that feedback. And in that same polling research we did, said only about 25 or 26% of evangelical Christians have ever heard a sermon on immigration in their church, but 80% said they would like to. And so I think that there's this appetite for how to do that and how to speak about it. But if I'm a pastor, I'm sitting there thinking, like, how do I talk about immigration without splitting my congregation and losing my job? And so I think that is like a real tension point for a lot of church leaders, is how to kind of bring that prophetic message of the gospel and the commandments very clearly in scripture to welcome the immigrant and welcome the stranger, and still do it in a way that really doesn't come across as overtly political and driving some sort of agenda.
Okay, Myal, I'm going to put you on the spot here. You've just told me 80% of evangelicals want to hear some teaching on immigration. Only 20% say they have heard something. Is that right? Did I summarize that correctly?
25 or 26%, yeah.
Okay. All right. So you've got the pulpit. Myal, what are the high level talking points that would comprise your sermon in terms of making the case for, welcoming the refugee?
Well, first of all, I think we have to look at Matthew 25 as a very powerful example of what should shape our social engagement. And so in that perspective, we see a call to welcome the poor, feed the hungry, heal the sick, welcome the stranger, the foreigner who is in our midst, visit people in prison. And so in that it should be part of our core offering of what it means to be ministering in society, number one. Number two, I think we see again and again in scripture that, the word that God defends the cause of the foreigner, and that the concerns and the realities and the struggles of the foreigner are something God cares about. And so we have to find that as something we ourselves care about. And then we also need to build our societies and our social nets, not just for what the church should do, but how we as a society come along people. That includes very intentionally the immigrant and the foreigner in our midst. And I think SNAP has been in the news of late, and food benefits being cut. And, with the government shutdown, there's great harm that's happening to many people who are hungry today because these benefits are going to be stopped. And in the big, beautiful bill, there was intentional reductions to that program, including removing certain classes of immigrants from being eligible to receive those benefits. And for me, I was reflecting on this and came back to Leviticus 23:22, I think it is, where it talks about this idea of gleaning and the idea that we are supposed to leave a portion, not we, but the people at the time were supposed to leave a portion of their crops along the outer edge for the poor and the foreigners living amongst us. And so I think that there's is a perspective of saying there need to be societal regulations to remind people to provide for the hungry, and included in that group were foreigners and immigrants. And so my perspective is this is at the heart of who God is and who God calls us to be as a society. And that needs not just to be out of the compassion of the church, but also out of the laws that we form and the policies that we form as a society.
Great sermon. Thank you very much. We'll now have the closing hymn. No, I'm just kidding. I actually want to jump on the pulpit with you, and a passage I've been reflecting a lot in conjunction with the refugee crisis is Luke 10, 25-37, the Good Samaritan. Right, a Samaritan is an outsider, in some ways a migrant, potentially in that particular situation. And it really struck me. I never really thought about this before, but that parable is meant to illustrate who is my neighbor and who am I supposed to love. And when you think about that term neighbor, it requires really an imagination of the neighborhood, that it is not just a purely individual one-on-one, but there's a whole ecosystem of actors called the neighborhood that's required to respond to God's call to care for the outsider, care for the foreigner. And even in that, parable, as short as it is, the Good Samaritan requires a institution called the inn, and an innkeeper there who's willing to take in for overnight or multiple nights this person that the Good Samaritan has brought in to care. And it just struck me as like, oh, that's a neighborhood. That's sort of a short snippet of a neighborhood that God intends to reflect his image of an interdependent set of actors, responding to the needs of the outsider. And it's very difficult for any one person to take on that load by themselves. So describe a little bit about, the ecosystem of response, and how, you have government, you have local nonprofits, you have churches, and you have individuals. How does this all stitch together as a collective institutional response to refugees?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think we need to look at the idea of what partnership truly means as a mechanism for welcome. And I think about, rather than thinking about first what are all the pieces that are needed, I think it's important to put ourselves into the shoes, into the perspectives of a newcomer, and to see how does someone move from just arriving in society and being received by a community to growing into a place where they feel welcome, to growing into a place where they feel like they belong and this is home. And that doesn't actually happen without multiple layers of society extending welcome to individuals. And so what pains me so much about the moment that we're living through, where there is so much anti-immigration rhetoric in the news, there are so many overt actions to detain, deport, remove people in this season, that it's actually taking individuals refugees, other people who fleeing humanitarian crisis, and said, you weren't welcome in your own country. You went to a neighboring country, you weren't welcome there. And now you've come here, and no, we don't want to make you feel welcome either. And so I think to that, there's a role for social service agencies and nonprofits like World Relief to step in and offer technical services and welcome and casework and follow up on cases. But the power of the church to be an instrument of welcome and to be a place of belonging is so crucial. And one thing that World Relief does in our work is we promote the idea of something called a good neighbor team. And it comes right back to your story of the Samaritan here, of who's a good neighbor and what makes a good neighbor. And this is typically a group of 5 to 10 people who come alongside a refugee family or a family of asylum seekers and says, we're going to be your partners, your friends, walk with you in this season. And that could mean driving someone to a doctor's appointment, navigating the aisles of Walmart, looking at all the school supplies, trying to go through a school supply list, which is just, it's complicated for me when I do that. It's complicated for somebody from a different culture when they have to do that. Standing in the grocery aisle saying, you just need this one mustard. You don't have to pick one of the 72 mustards that are on the shelves. And how do we do that? And so that focus of community that can come along with that, and the friendships that I've seen over the years. I met a person in Washington that had worked with a Vietnamese family 25 years ago, or 45 years ago, sorry, right in 1980. And they still exchange Christmas gifts between the two families every year, 45 years later, and what those connections are. And I think that's really what it takes to get to that place of belonging, is those multiple layers. But you also need effective government policy that helps welcome and engage people and put people on a path to growth here. When studies have been done, Notre Dame did a big research study that found that refugees in particular, the average refugee adult that's resettled contributes in their lifetime 19,000 and change more in taxes back to the government than they received in net, than they received in social services payments helping them at the beginning. And so I think that that's where we have to think about what is the potential of our immigrant neighbors, not that there's just this problem that we have to address, and how to come alongside that. And so I think that has to be at the heart of who we are, and recognizing that we need to see the inherent dignity and worth of our newest neighbors, and not just, it's like this problem we need to fix.
That's, I think that's at the heart of a lot of the anti-immigration rhetoric is, it's the kind of America first mentality that says we should only be caring for our own. And we can't, these people are a drain on social services and taxes and so forth. And so I think that piece of data that, the typical refugee or immigrant is a net positive is just a vision we've sort of lost in this country. The other thing that I do think that you bring up that feels like a net contribution, in addition to a financial net contribution, is like a spiritual net contribution, is that it activates something important and good spiritually for American Christians to not just care about ourselves, but to really, like you said, adopt this biblical mandate to care for the outsider, the foreigner, the migrant. Tell me other examples of where, that's a great example of an individual that you just shared who has connected with a family. How does this affect whole congregations? Well, what would be some stories you would share about churches that have really flourished and blossomed because they've in some way rallied around this kind of welcome?
Yeah, well, I to pick up on one of your points there, I also kind of want to recognize is that a huge number of recent immigrants to this country, not just refugees, but immigrants of many different variety, are Christians. And among the 100,000 or so refugees who came to the U.S. in 2024, the majority of those were Christians. Further, a third of those individuals, the 100,000 people who came, a third of those were Christians coming from one of the 50 countries in the world where Christians are persecuted the most. And so World Relief, we've done a study that has analyzed these factors along with Open Doors to see those connection points. And Open Doors watch lists of Christian persecution, you see regularly those people flee in those countries becoming candidates for the refugee program and being welcome. And so that's a really crucial thing that affects the population that we're talking about here. And so these are many people who have experienced persecution. They've experienced the need to flee because of their faith. And these are great contributors to the churches and the church communities that they become a part of. And I think what's encouraging is when you see churches that merge and integrate multiple cultures and multiple expressions of faith together. And I think about a church that I attended in the Baltimore area for many years, and it had a very significant Spanish-speaking population that I believe it started as a kind of a separate ministry of the church, but they'd worked very hard to integrate the kids' ministries together, and eventually the membership meetings. And so all of a sudden we're having membership meetings in two languages because you've got a third of the member Spanish is their first language. And it's really, even though they're oftentimes in a separate service, it's strengthening the church. These are some of the most committed, regular attending members of the congregation and the church. And it has that depth of strength. And I think so many of these societies, like we just need to see brothers and sisters in Christ as brothers and sisters in Christ. And at the heart of that, in the beginning of that piece. I think the other thing that concerns me a lot with Christians in the church in this season, though, is that there's approximately 10 million Christians in this country today who are subject to deportation. And that's a really tough reality. That's 1 in 12 Christians in the United States today are subject to deportation. Or sorry, 1 in 12 Christians in the US live with someone who is subject to deportation, or they themselves are subject to deportation. But that's a really significant piece, meaning that there's 7 million US citizen Christians who live with someone who is in that category. And so this is something we documented this as well in a report called the One Part of the Body Report, and talk about these dynamics. And I think we have to realize there's this kind of misnomer and this misunderstanding that everyone who is subject to deportation entered the country illegally. And there's 1.5 million people who entered the country legally, had legal status as of January 2025, and have now had that status revoked from them, who are subject to deportation. And these are individuals who have fled humanitarian crises around the world. And I think this is a real crisis for us, and for understanding for what that means in society, and for how the church can grapple with that and the impact that it will have on the local church.
Yeah, this reminds me of a point that Paco Amador, a pastor in Chicago, made on a recent episode in this immigration series we're doing. Well, actually, I think I made the point, but it was in response to him talking about how his congregation was so under threat by ICE raids and families being disrupted and so forth. And I just made the point, like, many conservative evangelical churches have a regularly pray for the persecuted church abroad, without recognizing that these raids, the deportation, is persecuting churches here in the United States. And you're adding sort of another angle onto that, which is to say that we're also cutting off a source of church growth for many parts of our body when we so drastically cut off the flow of immigrants who, like you said, so many of them are refugees. And just the threat of family disruption, separation, is really, among Christians, is something that we really should, as Christians, regardless of our political affiliation, should be deeply concerned about. So thank you for raising that. Myal, let's go back to this high level. Describe, you've adverted to this, but I want you to describe more specifically what the change in U.S. government policy has been in the last 9 months to refugees, immigrants. Like, what is different now than it was a year ago, and what is the sort of human picture of that change, the human toll?
Yeah, it's a great question. As I mentioned earlier, last year in 2024, the U.S. welcomed 100,000 refugees to the U.S. And in January of this year, just 4 or 5 days into the Trump administration, actually the day of the inauguration, an executive order was issued that functionally suspended the refugee admittance program indefinitely. The program was only really reopened for a very small group of individuals, which fell into the category of being Afrikaners, white South Africans, under the grounds that they were facing discrimination in South Africa. And so largely the only refugees who've been welcomed, with a few very minor exceptions, have been a few hundred Afrikaners who've come to this country. I don't think reasonably you can apply that same definition I talked about at the beginning of the episode of facing persecution and being forced to cross your country's borders in order to obtain refugee status as fully and truly applying in that context. And so what you see happening is that number has been reduced significantly now. In today, as a matter of fact, the White House issued the formal presidential determination for the government's fiscal year 2026, and said that the cap of refugees for the year will be 7,500 individuals, and that Afrikaners again will be included as part of that 7,500. And so what that signals is in the world, this will be one of the lowest, if not the lowest year of refugee resettlement on record for the US at a time when the refugee crisis as a whole is at its highest level. And I think this is really a significant reality for us, that we are identifying a specific population that does not meet the full threshold of a refugee definition to serve within that program at the expense of seats and spots for people who are fleeing crises in Congo or Sudan or Burma or other locations.
Yeah. And that has actually ramifications, not just for the people who are incoming, but even for some refugees who are here, right, Myal, who are waiting to be reunited with family members. And now that that prospect has been completely dashed.
That's right. And I've gotten to know a married couple who faced separation themselves during the first Trump administration because of very similar refugee policies. And so they were a married couple from a country in Asia that was predominantly a Muslim country. They fled to a neighboring country separately, with the plan that would look less suspicious if they left separately. They were Christians and being targeted for their faith. And the wife got across the border safely. The husband was stopped and kept a few months. And then the wife was approved as a refugee to enter the United States. The husband got across the border, got approved for refugee status. But with the reduction in refugee numbers, he was not able to meet his wife for over 5 years. And they spent that time separated. And so really the reduction to the refugee policy has a terrible effect on family separation for these cases where people have been, one person is here already, the other has yet to come, has terrible effects on protections for persecuted Christians as well, as that story also illustrates. And I think that's something that we as Christians need to grapple with in terms of what it means to recognize our moral responsibility in this section, and to say, if we really think that the sanctity of families is a really crucial and important thing, we should have policies that look to protect families, reunite families that have faced separation, and see how to do that. And also, we should be deeply concerned about the persecuted Christians. And you mentioned earlier churches that pray every week for the persecuted church. Those should be the same people advocating for welcoming persecuted Christians who have nowhere else to go and to live safely. And I think that is a crucial step in the work that we do.
Myal, I want to ask you to just, again, fill out the context a little, because I think people listening, and myself indeed, look, here are these numbers that you've been saying that have been cut even more. And then we think, well, where are these people going to then? What countries are opening their doors? Then that really should be a role model for us as a country. What are the countries, keeping their doors open?
Well, the vast majority of refugees reside in a neighboring country. And I don't have the exact statistic at my fingertips, but it's around 3/4 of refugees reside in a low or middle income country. And so this concept of refugee resettlement really caters to a very small number of the total refugees that exist in the world. Other countries in Europe have been known to take refugees and do so. Germany showed great leadership in the midst of the Syrian refugee crisis, and to great controversy in that country, but did show great leadership. And so Europe will take some as well. I think there is a disturbing trend, though. The US takes the largest numbers of refugees, and when we reduce our number, that signals to Europe to take similar actions. And so I think that US leadership in the world is a very real thing in terms of foreign policy and matters like this. And so you see European countries oftentimes opting to take fewer refugees when the US steps back from that program and its obligations.
Yeah, and I think it's important to recognize that the sort of rise of anti-immigrant sort of rhetoric and sentiment, it's not just reserved to the US. It is in some ways a global phenomenon, disturbingly so, and in Europe as well. I think I've shared this before on this podcast, but I'll share it again here, of just my own personal touch point on the refugee crisis. My wife and I have taken in now, I think, 3 or 4 refugee families to house them at an interim level before they can get more permanent housing. 2 of those families were Afghan families. And we really felt strongly about that because not only because of a biblical responsibility, but in some ways just a broader moral responsibility, because our country created in some ways their refugee status. Both of these families were had a husband that was working for the U.S. Armed Forces there, and was the reason for why they were granted refugee status. And so we've seen at least 2 of these families come through, wonderful families and so forth. What was really heartbreaking was the fact that, as you mentioned at the beginning of January, how quickly and immediately and traumatically uh, benefits were cut for them, but also uh, funding for the local nonprofit that we'd worked with was also decimated. And so, our caseworker told us also then about stories of refugee families who had a plane ticket, were at the airport and were turned back, that very day because of the executive order you mentioned. So it's my own little touch point of this issue is sort of filled with a lot of trauma and heartbreak. Um, can you how widespread is this across the system?
Well, your experience is very typical of what we've seen happen throughout uh, the country with churches and others, people of faith who have had a commitment to welcome refugees over the years. My church here in Virginia, we had made a commitment to a family that a couple of the adult brothers were already in the U.S. with their families, some without their spouses, and they were working through all the legal channels and means to bring over their mother and then other siblings and then the spouses, and it was a whole network of people. And very quickly, they had visas approved and steps approved in the process, ready to come. And then along comes, January 20th, and essentially all of those processes are canceled and ended here. And these are individuals who are living in Pakistan, a neighboring country that has not been welcoming to the Afghans that have fled Afghanistan. And so they're facing additional persecution in Pakistan. They can't go back safely to Afghanistan. And the U.S. has basically said, but we don't want those individuals to come, and has created a lot of barriers. And so, that has deep moral implications here, where the U.S. government has made promises to many Afghans who aided and supported the work of U.S. foreign policy in Afghanistan for many years. And I think many churches, like yours, like mine, stood up and said, we want to be part of welcoming these individuals and creating this opportunity for people who going to America would not be their first choice of places to move in the world. Their first choice would be to live in a place that is a safe Afghanistan. I think the other thing to keep in mind with the Afghanistan crisis that's unique here is with Afghanistan and with Ukraine, many of those people who came to the country came in underneath humanitarian parole back in 2021, not as refugees. And so even some of those individuals who've come over the last couple of years have immigration statuses that are not permanent statuses, and they're subject to being revoked or lost. And so there's great need to even protect the Afghans who have come here, who have followed all the rules to date, have stayed within legal status, but are subject to losing that status really at any stroke of the pen from the White House. And so to keep that there. But I also bring a little bit of hope. And I think I would bring this too, that World Relief, there was kind of a small window over the last few years, even though the formal refugee resettlement program was closed, individuals who were from Afghanistan and had SIV visas, the special immigrant visas, these are individuals who had helped the U.S. government, did have a way in certain circumstances to come to this country, but they had to pay their own way. There was no payment for that. And so we've seen close to 20 churches around the country who've said, just pair me with any family who can legally come. We'll buy their plane ticket. We'll set them up an apartment. We'll welcome them into our homes. And it's been very encouraging to see those churches step up and to do that and show that commitment.
We'll expand on that. Like, what would be your invitation to either individual Christians who are listening to this, or pastors who can try to maybe mobilize their church? Like, what's the call to action here?
Well, I think the call to action is stand up and be a church of welcome and do something big for people who are facing incredible persecution and great difficulty in this world. And if you want to find out some very specific steps on how to do that, you can go to World Relief's website. You can go to churchesofwelcome.org or Google World Relief Churches of Welcome, and you'll be able to find and get connected to resources that we've designed specifically for that. We have people to help make those connections and those pairings to help people take steps of that journey and to do that. But I would challenge churches to ask the question, what can you do to do the big thing for a family that's facing desperate circumstances right now?
Well, I want to close with a personal question to you, which is this. It's been my observation that, Christians leading, working in relief agencies, service organizations that have been severely affected by, cuts in the government spending, whether it's USID getting eliminated or other government programs, that this is just a tough season. And again, the pain of a Christian working in or leading one of these organizations is nothing compared to a immigrant family about to face deportation or suffering. So I'm not trying to equate that, but it is a meaningful level of discouragement, a sense of struggle. How are you getting through this? How are you're at the front lines of a lot of the dynamics that feel so painful that you've described. What does this call for right now, even for your own faith and your own spiritual journey?
Yeah, I think I'm reminded in my own life that it's my faith that has put me into this work and motivated me to begin this journey. And I became a believer in my early 20s, and very early in my Christian walk, God opened up the scriptures to me related to his heart for the poor, his heart for justice, and what that means. And that took me to Africa. And I spent my first 9 years at World Relief working in Rwanda and in neighboring DRC, where I spent quite a few trips and time working is one of a great places of displacement and war and conflict. And remember my first year living in Africa, walking through many of the refugee camps and the IDP camps at the time, and meeting one father in particular who was holding his daughter who was deathly ill and just pleading with help for someone to take her, to someone to care for her, and what that meant. And just, I carried in that moment this question of, like, what is it that would cause someone to choose to live in this camp? And then going and seeing that, and then going several months after that to a community where many of these people had fled from, and to seeing where the mass graves were and where people had been killed and the massacres, and as they toured the camp to see that, and know, like, this is great terror that people have fled from. And so I mention all of this to say that, it was my faith that motivated me to go. I've seen and met and experienced the events that have caused people to flee, and not to lose sight of that suffering that's at the heart of that, and that motivation. It's hard. It feels like we get punched in the gut on a daily basis in this work over the last few months. But it's also my faith that carries me through those moments. And I think that I come back to, what can be our bigger imagination of the restoration that we want to see. And, it's very easy to pray against this particular policy, or pray for this deportation case to be resolved appropriately, or pray for restored funding for the refugee program. But at the end of the day, I think we have to come back to and say, your kingdom come. And what does it mean to really to lean into a prayer, coming out of our lament of longing for that deeper vision of the restoration and the new heavens and the new earth. And I love in Isaiah when there's a discussion of the new heavens and the new earth, and it says, no longer, so people will build houses and they will dwell in the houses they will build. They'll plant fields and eat the crops that they eat. No longer will children die, but a few months old. And I think that's a vision that we need to be for, and our imagination needs to drive us towards. And I think in society today, we get too caught up in the back and forth and the micro engagements as it relates to this policy or that policy, or complaining about this thing that's happening, as opposed to coming back to saying, we worship and follow a God who is the Redeemer and the restorer of a broken world, and came into this world in John 16:33 and said, you will face trials and tribulations, but have courage. I have overcome the world. And I think about that a lot, is that idea. It's like, have courage. That's an instruction. If we don't come back to the faith as the reason that we're here, we can get misguided and lost very easily.
It's a great word, Myal. Thank you for sharing that with us. It applies to so many different things happening in this world right now, that we are invited to courage, to have our eyes set upon the promise of the new heavens and new earth. You said, like, I think if you're a Christian at any age, but in this particular era, that's the great invitation to do so. And it does take courage, and it also takes role models of people doing that. And so thank you, both individually for being a role model, for leading an organization that I think is an institutional role model. We're really grateful for the work you're doing. And thank you for coming on the Good Faith Podcast.
Well, thank you, Curtis. It was my pleasure.
All right, listeners, we will next week once again try to nurture our imaginations of the kingdom to come, the new heavens and new earth, when we gather around the campfire.